The sky is watching. Alexei hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, tiny black crosses moving against the gray winter sky. At first, they looked like birds, innocent and distant, but birds didn't hover in place. Birds didn't make that sound. The persistent, whining buzz that signaled death could be watching, selecting, deciding. He shifted his weight, adjusting his position in the frozen mud of the trench. His rifle rested across his knees, crusted with grime. He'd stopped cleaning it obsessively after the first week. What was the point? The mud was everywhere. In his boots, his clothes, his ears. The only things that stayed clean were the drones. Those mechanical predators that circled above, pristine and purposeful. Smoke? Vadim offered him a crumpled pack of cigarettes. At 29, Vadim was one of the older conscripts in their unit. A former factory worker from Novosibirsk with a perpetually amused expression that hadn't faded even after 2 months at the front. Alexei shook his head. They see the ember at night, through thermal. Vadim tucked the cigarettes away with a shrug. If they want to find us, they'll find us. Smoke or no smoke. That was the truth of it, the horrible truth that kept Alexei awake despite his exhaustion. In this war, you were never truly hidden. The sky was always watching. 4 months ago, he'd been sitting in a lecture hall at Tomsk Polytechnic, studying civil engineering, dreaming of building bridges and high-rises. Now he was huddled in a muddy ditch 5 kilometers from a Ukrainian village whose name he couldn't pronounce, waiting for someone he'd never met to kill him, or for the order to kill someone he'd never met. The mobilization notice had arrived at his dormitory on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, he was at a processing center, his student ID and deferment papers waved away by board officials. Full mobilization means full, the desk sergeant had told him without looking up from his clipboard. University can wait. The motherland cannot. His mother had wept at the train station. His father, a former army officer from the Afghanistan days, had stood stiffly beside her, offering advice Alexei half listened to. Keep your head down. Follow orders. This will end, one way or another. One way or another. Those words echoed now as the sky grew darker. The hour before dawn was the most dangerous, when the night vision drones came out but visibility for human eyes was at its worst. The platoon had lost Dmitri that way 3 days ago. A whisper from above, then light and noise and Dmitri gone, replaced by a crater and scattered red fragments in the snow. Movement check, came the lieutenant's voice from further down the line. Rotate positions in 10 minutes. Alexei nodded, though no one could see him. The orders were always the same. Move, but not too much. Stay hidden, but don't stay still. Be vigilant, but try to sleep. Contradictions piled upon contradictions, all in service to one goal, staying alive for one more day. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to remember. His dormitory room with its sagging bed and desk piled high with textbooks. His girlfriend Masha's apartment, warm and smelling of the herbal tea she drank constantly. The lecture hall with its ancient projector that Professor Baranov was forever cursing as it flickered and died mid-presentation. Normal life, a life where the sky was just the sky, not an all-seeing enemy waiting to deliver judgment. A buzz cut through his thoughts, faint at first, then growing louder. His eyes snapped open, body tense. Drone, someone whispered urgently from down the line. Get down. But where was down when you were already pressed into the earth? How did you hide when the cameras above could see heat, could see movement, could maybe even see fear? The buzzing grew louder. Petro. 5 kilometers away, across churned fields and through a skeletal forest stripped by artillery, Petro Kovalenko adjusted the small monitor screen attached to his wrist. The image jittered and settled, an infrared view of Russian positions along a shallow ravine. He could make out 7, maybe 8 heat signatures. Men huddled in their improvised shelters, probably thinking themselves concealed by the pre-dawn darkness. That's them, Maxim said beside him, his breath fogging in the bitter cold. Echo 3 confirms troop movements consistent with the 35th Motorized. Sending data now. Petro nodded, watching as his partner tapped commands into a tablet. They were perched in the upper room of an abandoned farmhouse, the walls partially collapsed but offering enough shelter for their operation. Their gear, 3 reconnaissance drones and 1 armed with a modified RPG warhead, was spread across what had once been someone's dining table. Who do you think lived here? Petro asked, not for the first time. He'd been asking this question at every ruined home they used as a position. It had become a ritual of sorts, a reminder. Maxim didn't look up from his screen. Farmers, probably. Like your family. We weren't farmers, Petro corrected automatically. My father worked construction. I worked construction. You were a construction worker who grew potatoes in his garden. That's a farmer where I come from. It was an old joke between them, worn smooth with repetition. The familiar words brought momentary comfort, something normal in this abnormal existence. Petro had never planned to be a soldier. When the invasion began, he'd evacuated his wife Sophia and their infant daughter to his wife's sister in Lviv. He'd intended to join them, to wait out the madness in the relative safety of the West. But then the videos had appeared online, Russian vehicles moving through his hometown, soldiers checking papers in the square where he'd played as a child, where he'd proposed to Sophia 4 years earlier. So instead of going west, he'd registered with the Territorial Defense Forces. They'd given him 3 days of training, how to handle an AK, basic formations, rudimentary first aid. It hadn't prepared him for any of this. Nothing could have. Launch Sparrow 2, Maxim said, referring to their smallest drone. Let's get a closer look at their rotation patterns. Petro complied, fingers working the small controller with practiced ease. The little quadcopter, smaller than a dinner plate and nearly silent, lifted from the table and slipped through the broken window into the dark morning air. The screen on his wrist flickered to life with new data. Thermal imaging showed the Russian positions more clearly now. He could make out individual soldiers, some standing, some sitting, one walking a slow patrol along their line. They have no idea we're watching, Maxim murmured, his face ghostly in the blue light of the monitor. Petro nodded, but felt the familiar discomfort rising in his chest. This was the part that still bothered him most, the voyeurism of it, the one-sided intimacy. Through the drone's camera, he observed these men in their private moments. He watched them smoke, eat, relieve themselves, stare vacantly into space. He saw them check photos on their phones, write letters, pray. Before they killed them, they knew them, not as friends, not even as proper enemies, but as subjects in an unblinking digital gaze. It felt wrong somehow, though he couldn't articulate why. War had always been personal. Men had always killed men they could see. But not like this. Not after watching them for days, cataloging their habits, learning their patterns. Command wants a strike on their command post, Maxim said, checking a message on his phone. Coordinates coming through now. We have visual confirmation of officer presence? Not yet. That's what Sparrow 2 is for. Petro guided the tiny drone lower, keeping it above the tree line but bringing it closer to the Russian positions. The image sharpened. He could see faces now. Young faces. Tired faces. Much like the faces in his own unit. There, Maxim pointed to the screen. By that covered position. See the officer insignia? Petro zoomed in. A figure in a better uniform than the others, conferring with 2 soldiers over what appeared to be a map. Their command element, likely planning the day's operations. I see him. Good. Mark the coordinates and prepare Angel 1. Angel 1 was their strike drone, a larger model equipped with a modified RPG warhead. The black humor of the name wasn't lost on Petro. There was nothing angelic about what it did, but that was war, calling destruction salvation, calling death service. He transferred the coordinates to the strike system, then hesitated, finger hovering over the launch command. Problem? Maxim asked. Petro shook his head, just double-checking the civilian structure proximity. It wasn't a lie, exactly. The farmhouses in this area were scattered but present. What he didn't say was that he always hesitated now, ever since the strike 3 weeks ago when they'd taken out a Russian ammunition truck only to watch, via drone feed, as the secondary explosion had thrown burning debris onto a nearby house. The house had caught fire. Through the thermal imaging, they'd seen heat signatures inside, people who'd stayed despite the evacuation orders, people who had nowhere else to go. They'd watched, helpless, as those heat signatures had moved frantically, then grown still. Area is clear, Maxim confirmed, misinterpreting his pause. Nearest structure is abandoned and 300 meters east. Petro nodded and pressed the launch command. Angel 1 rose from their table with a high-pitched whine, its larger frame requiring more power and generating more noise than the reconnaissance models. Flight path programmed, he confirmed. Impact in approximately 4 minutes. Now came the strangest part of modern warfare, the waiting. They sat in silence, 2 men in a ruined farmhouse, watching a screen that showed other men going about their morning routines, unaware that death was already in the air, already chosen, already inescapable. Petro thought of his daughter Nadia, not yet a year old. Would she grow up in a world where this was normal? Where people died beneath machines piloted from kilometers away, selected through a screen, eliminated with the press of a button? It wasn't that the killing itself was new. War had always been about killing. But something about this distance, this detachment, felt like a dangerous step. As if humanity wasn't meant to have this power. The power of gods, to smite from above without risk, without consequence. Except there were consequences. Just not physical ones. Not for him and Maxim. The consequences were inside. In the dreams that came each night. In the growing numbness when they confirmed another successful strike. 1 minute to impact, Maxim said, eyes fixed on the screen. Petro watched the thermal signatures of the Russians, still unaware. The officer was gesturing at something, perhaps explaining a tactical movement. 2 soldiers had moved to a small fire, probably heating rations or coffee. 1 figure sat slightly apart, head bowed, reading or praying or simply staring at the ground. People. They were people. 30 seconds. Alexei. The buzzing had stopped. Alexei waited, breath held, for the explosion that often followed. The signature of the Ukrainian attack drones that struck without warning. But seconds ticked by and nothing happened. Reconnaissance, Vadim whispered, sensing his tension. Just looking. That was almost worse. It meant they were being watched, studied, perhaps marked for a later strike. The Ukrainians were efficient that way. They rarely wasted their explosive drones on individual soldiers. They watched, they waited, they struck when officers were present or when multiple men gathered together. Intelligence had briefed them on the enemy's drone tactics during their abbreviated training. The small quadcopters were for reconnaissance, finding targets, confirming positions. The larger ones delivered explosives, sometimes grenades, sometimes more powerful munitions. The truly terrifying ones were the fixed-wing drones that came from farther away, carrying warheads that could destroy a tank. And those were just the ones they knew about. Rumors circulated of experimental models, AI-controlled hunters that didn't need human pilots, microscopic drones that could kill with poison needles, swarms that could darken the sky like mechanical locusts. Alexei didn't know how many of these rumors were true. He only knew that each day brought some new technological horror to the battlefield. Movement in 10, the lieutenant's voice came again, barely audible. They would change positions under the cover of early dawn, using the tree line for concealment. It was a daily ritual, never stay in one place long enough to be targeted. But the drones were always watching, always following. Alexei checked his watch. Less than 5 minutes until they moved. He used the time to mentally prepare. Which tree to move to first, how many seconds to wait before the next dash, which routes offered the best cover. His training hadn't covered any of this. The 2 weeks at the mobilization center had focused on basics, how to fire his rifle, how to address officers, how to march in formation. Nothing about drone warfare, nothing about the psychological toll of constant surveillance. They'd prepared him to fight the last war, not this one. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The lieutenant emerging from his covered position, gesturing to the communications officer beside him. They were looking at something. A map perhaps, planning the day's operations. 2 more soldiers joined them, warming their hands over a small hexamine stove that gave off almost no smoke. Alexei checked his watch again. 3 minutes until movement. He should be getting ready, securing his equipment, preparing his mind for the dash between positions. Instead, he found himself watching the group by the lieutenant's position. 4 men together in the open. A target, they should know better. He opened his mouth to call a warning, though it wasn't his place to correct officers. The words never left his lips. The first indication was a change in the air, a disturbance so subtle it might have been imagination. Then came the sound, not the buzz of a quadcopter but the higher whine of something moving much faster. Alexei had just enough time to register fear before the world exploded into light and pressure and noise. Petro. Direct hit, Maxim confirmed, eyes on the screen as the thermal bloom of the explosion expanded and then contracted. Command post eliminated. Petro watched the silent destruction on his monitor. The heat signatures where the officers had gathered were gone, replaced by a diffuse glow of scattered debris and fire. Other figures moved frantically, soldiers rushing to help their comrades or to take cover from a threat that had already delivered its payload. He'd seen this scene dozens of times, but it never became easier to watch. The transition from living men to absence happened too quickly for the mind to process. One moment they existed, breathing, thinking, feeling beings with histories and futures. The next moment, they were simply gone, erased with a precision that seemed obscene in its efficiency. Good work, Maxim said, clapping him on the shoulder. Command confirms 4 KIA, including their lieutenant. KIA killed in action. The acronym made it sound orderly, professional. Not like men ripped apart in an instant, their remains scattered across frozen ground. We should move, Petro said, beginning to pack up their equipment. The Russians would have approximate coordinates from the drone's flight path. They wouldn't stay in the same place to wait for counter-battery fire. They worked quickly, disassembling their remaining drones and packing them into padded cases. The strike drone, Angel 1, wouldn't return. It had delivered its payload and been destroyed in the process, a kamikaze of silicon and carbon fiber. Within 10 minutes, they were moving through the ruined village, heading towards their next designated position 2 kilometers east. The morning light revealed the devastation that surrounded them: collapsed walls, roofless houses, the skeleton of a burned-out school. This had once been someone's community, a place where people had lived ordinary lives, shopping at the local market, teaching in that school, celebrating weddings in the small Orthodox church whose bell tower now tilted at a precarious angle. "You're quiet," Maxim observed as they picked their way across a debris-filled street. "Just thinking." "About what?" Petro hesitated. Maxim was not just his partner but his friend, a former software developer from Kharkiv whose entire apartment building had been destroyed in the early days of the war. But even with friends, certain thoughts were difficult to voice. "Do you ever wonder about the men we kill?" he asked finally. Maxim's stride didn't falter. "Not really, they're soldiers in an invading army. But they're also just men. Like us." "Not like us," Maxim's voice hardened. "We didn't invade their country. We didn't bomb their homes. Most of them are conscripts. They didn't choose to be here. They could refuse, desert, surrender. And be shot? Imprisoned? Have their families punished? What would you do in their position?" Maxim stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why are we having this conversation? We did our job. We took out enemy commanders who were planning operations that would have killed our people." Petro sighed. I know all the reasons. I believe in what we're doing. He struggled to find the words. I just wish we didn't have to watch them so closely before we kill them. It makes them people." "They are people," Maxim said quietly. "That's the point. If we forget that, we become something else." He adjusted the strap of his equipment bag. "It's good that it bothers you. The day it stops bothering you is the day you should worry." They continued in silence through the village. Overhead, the sky was brightening to a clear winter blue. A beautiful day for killing, Petro thought grimly. Good visibility for the drones. Their new position was an abandoned police station on the eastern edge of the village. The building was relatively intact, with good sight lines and multiple exit routes, important considerations in their line of work. They set up quickly, establishing their communications link with headquarters and preparing 2 reconnaissance drones for launch. "New orders," Maxim said, checking a secure messaging app on his tablet. "They want surveillance on the convoy route through Sector 7. Petro consulted the digital map. Sector 7 was the designation for an area 5 kilometers northeast, encompassing a key supply road the Russians were using to move equipment to the front. "Launch window?" "As soon as possible. Intelligence indicates movement expected within the hour." Petro began preparing Sparrow 3, their long-range reconnaissance drone with enhanced battery life. This would be strictly observation, watching, recording, transmitting data back to headquarters for analysis. As he worked, a notification pinged on Maxim's tablet. "Artillery units reporting Russian counter-battery fire in our previous sector," Maxim said, glancing at the screen. "Good thing we moved." Petro nodded, but felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. The Russians were getting better at tracking their drone operations, narrowing down launch locations faster. It was an arms race of sorts, better drones versus better counter-drone measures, each side adapting to the other's tactics in an endless technological spiral. "Sparrow 3 ready," he reported, completing the pre-flight checks. "Launch when ready." Petro sent the drone up through a broken skylight, its small electric motors whirring softly as it ascended into the bright morning sky. Within seconds, it was just a speck, then invisible, though the data link confirmed it was functioning perfectly. He guided it northeast, towards Sector 7, flying at an altitude of 300 meters, high enough to avoid small arms fire but low enough to gather detailed imagery. The video feed showed empty roads cutting through bare winter fields and patches of forest. No sign of the expected convoy yet. "I'm picking up radio traffic," Maxim said, monitoring their signals intelligence equipment. "Russian communications, encrypted but with identifiable patterns. Convoy elements, most likely." Petro adjusted the drone's course slightly, bringing it over the main road that cut through the sector. Still nothing visible. Then movement caught his eye, not on the road but in a small wooded area beside it. He zoomed in the camera. "I have visual on a defensive position," he reported. "Looks like an advanced security element for the convoy." The screen showed Russian soldiers establishing a hasty checkpoint, positioning a heavy machine gun with good coverage of the approaching road, standard procedure for convoy security, clearing the route ahead of the main column. "Getting good imagery," Maxim confirmed, "the data feeding automatically to headquarters. They'll want us to maintain observation until the convoy arrives." Petro settled in for a potentially long mission, keeping the drone in a holding pattern that minimized its visibility while maintaining a clear view of the checkpoint. This was the monotonous part of drone warfare. Hours of watching, waiting, recording. The Russians below were unaware of the electronic eye above them, documenting their every move, potentially marking them for destruction. He wondered if any of them ever looked up, searching the empty sky for the invisible threat they knew was there. Did they feel it, that sensation of being watched? Did they have nightmares about mechanical birds of prey, as he had nightmares about artillery that could strike without warning? "Convoy approaching," Maxim announced after 20 minutes of observation. "Multiple vehicles, coming from the northeast." Petro adjusted the camera angle and saw them. A line of trucks and armored personnel carriers moving at a steady pace down the road. Not a major convoy, perhaps 10 vehicles in total, but a valuable intelligence find nonetheless. "Command wants continuous tracking," Maxim relayed. "Follow them to their destination if possible." "Battery at 68%, Petro noted. "We should have enough range if they're heading to the forward supply base we identified yesterday." As the lead vehicles approached the checkpoint, Petro noticed increased activity among the security element, soldiers standing straighter, officers checking documents, the machine gun crew becoming more alert. Standard procedure? Nothing unusual. Yet something felt wrong. A prickling sensation at the back of his neck, an instinct developed over months of drone operations. "Something's off," he murmured. "What do you mean?" Maxim looked up from his tablet. "Not sure. The security element seems tense." "They're in a war zone. Everyone's tense." Petro shook his head, struggling to articulate what he was seeing. "It's different. Look at their positioning." He zoomed the camera in on the machine gun crew. They weren't facing the road as expected but were oriented towards a stand of trees opposite their position. "They're expecting something from the southwest, not the road," he said. Maxim studied the feed. "Could be nothing. Covering their flanks." "Maybe." Petro wasn't convinced. He widened the camera view, scanning the area around the checkpoint. That's when he saw it, the faintest of movements in the trees opposite the Russian position. He zoomed in, adjusted for light conditions. "We've got company," he said with sudden urgency. "Ukrainian special forces, possibly." The camera revealed what appeared to be 2, possibly 3 figures in camouflage, moving with the careful precision of trained operators. "Switching to command channel," Maxim said, adjusting their communications equipment. "They need to know about this immediately." While Maxim contacted headquarters, Petro kept the drone's camera trained on the developing situation. The Ukrainian forces, he could now confirm at least 4 operators, were moving into position with a clear line of sight to the checkpoint. Their equipment suggested a strike team, possibly targeting the convoy. "Command confirms special operations activity in that sector," Maxim reported. "We're to maintain surveillance but not interfere." Petro nodded, understanding the implications. They were witnessing an ambush in the making, a high-risk operation targeting valuable Russian equipment or personnel. The convoy was now stopping at the checkpoint, the lead vehicle being inspected by Russian security forces. Petro scanned each vehicle, looking for anything that might explain the special forces' interest. The third vehicle in line stood out, a communications truck with distinctive antenna arrays, a valuable target that would disrupt Russian command and control capabilities in the sector. "I think that's the target," he said, indicating the truck. "Electronic warfare capabilities." Maxim agreed. "Makes sense. Take out their communications. Isolate this section of the front." They watched in silence as the drama unfolded below them. The convoy began moving again, passing through the checkpoint. The Ukrainian operators maintained their position, watching, waiting for the right moment. It would happen soon. The attack. More death, more destruction, all observed through the detached eye of their drone. Petro felt the familiar hollowness expanding in his chest, the sense of being both participant and spectator in this mechanized killing. Then a new sound intruded, not from the video feed but from outside their building, a distinctive buzz that caused both men to freeze. Drone, Maxim whispered, unnecessarily. They'd been found. Alexei. Consciousness returned in fragments. First came pain, his head, his chest, his left arm all screaming for attention. Then noise, ringing in his ears punctuated by muffled shouting. Finally sight, blurry shapes moving against a too bright sky. Alexei blinked, trying to understand what had happened. He was lying on his back, staring up at bare tree branches. His body felt wrong somehow, distant yet intensely present in its suffering. Memory returned in a rush. The drone strike, the lieutenant's position, the explosion. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his chest. Broken ribs, possibly. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, wet with what he assumed was blood. Medic, someone was shouting nearby. We need a medic here. Alexei turned his head slowly, fighting waves of nausea. The lieutenant's position was gone, replaced by a shallow crater and scattered debris, dark shapes on the ground that he refused to recognize as human remains. Soldiers moved through the chaos, tending to the wounded, securing equipment. Vadim appeared above him, face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood. Don't move, you idiot. Medic's coming. The lieutenant? Alexei asked, his voice sounding strange in his damaged ears. Vadim's expression told him everything. Gone. Orlov, Stepanin, and Andrei too. 4 men erased in an instant. Men he'd eaten with, complained with, shared the miserable conditions of the front with. The drone, Alexei began. Suicide type. Came in fast, straight at the command post. Vadim knelt beside him, examining his wounds with limited medical knowledge. You were lucky. Far enough away to just catch the blast wave. Lucky. The word seemed absurd in context. What kind of luck was this, lying injured in a frozen forest in a foreign country, fighting a war he didn't believe in? The sound of approaching artillery changed the situation instantly. Whistling overhead, incoming shells, likely Ukrainian forces taking advantage of the confusion caused by the drone strike. We need to move, Vadim shouted, looking around frantically. Counter battery fire. The first shell landed 30 meters away, shaking the earth and sending dirt and shrapnel in all directions. Alexei felt Vadim grab him under the arms, dragging him towards the relative cover of a fallen tree. The pain was extraordinary, but the alternative was worse. More shells were landing now, walking their way through the Russian positions with terrible accuracy. They're targeting the whole line, someone shouted. Full artillery strike. Through the ringing in his ears and the chaos around him, Alexei heard the distinctive sound that had come to define his nightmares, the buzzing of drones. Not one but many, a chorus of mechanical predators circling above. They're correcting artillery with drones, Vadim said, his voice tight with fear, giving real-time targeting data. It was a common tactic, one they'd been briefed on but had no effective counter for. Ukrainian drones would identify Russian positions, then guide artillery strikes with precision, adjusting as troops moved to escape. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The sky was watching, always watching. We need to get to the fallback position, Vadim said, helping Alexei to his feet. Can you walk? Alexei nodded, though he wasn't certain. His body felt disconnected, operating on some primal survival programming rather than conscious control. They began moving through the woods, away from the heaviest shelling, towards a secondary position established for just such an emergency. Other soldiers appeared from the chaos, some wounded, all wearing the same expression of contained terror. The new sergeant, promoted instantly upon the lieutenant's death, was trying to organize their retreat. Maintain dispersion. 5 meters between men. Don't bunch up. Standard anti-drone tactics. Don't present a valuable target. Don't group together where a single strike could take out multiple soldiers. Alexei stumbled along, supported partly by Vadim, partly by his own desperate will to survive. His vision swam in and out of focus. The pain in his chest made each breath a separate agony. The buzzing followed them, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, but never completely absent. The mechanical sound had become the soundtrack to their nightmare, the audible manifestation of an enemy they couldn't fight back against. 1 kilometer to the fallback, Vadim assured him as they navigated through dense underbrush. They have a medical station there. Alexei nodded, saving his breath for the effort of movement. 1 kilometer. He could manage that. 1 step at a time. Left foot, right foot. Ignore the pain. Ignore the buzzing. Ignore the shell still landing behind them. A sudden shout from ahead brought their small group to a halt. The sergeant raised his fist, the signal to freeze. Ambush position, he hissed back through the line. Ukrainian infantry, 2 o'clock. Alexei felt a new kind of fear grip him. Infantry meant direct combat, not the impersonal death from above they'd been fleeing. In his current state, he was worse than useless in a firefight. "Get down," Vadim whispered, helping him to a prone position behind a fallen log. "Stay quiet." The forest fell silent except for the ever-present buzzing of drones. No one moved. No one spoke. Every man trying to become invisible, to melt into the frozen earth and tangled underbrush. Through the ringing in his ears, Alexei heard faint sounds of movement from the direction the sergeant had indicated. Twigs snapping, the subtle rustle of equipment. Ukrainian forces, moving through the same forest, perhaps fleeing the same artillery, perhaps hunting for survivors of the drone strike. The proximity of the enemy changed something in Alexei's perception. For months, the Ukrainians had been an abstraction, unseen figures directing drones and artillery from a distance. Now they were flesh and blood men moving through the same woods, breathing the same air, experiencing the same fear. The sergeant was using hand signals to organize their response, directing soldiers to covering positions, establishing fields of fire. Despite his injuries, Alexei knew he should be preparing as well. His rifle was still slung across his back, untouched since the drone strike. With painful slowness, he brought the weapon forward, checking its condition. Dirt in the mechanism, but it would still fire. He had 3 magazines remaining. Enough for a firefight, if it came to that. Vadim was similarly preparing, his movements economical and precise. Like Alexei, he'd never wanted this war. A factory worker with 2 children, he'd been swept up in the mobilization with no recourse, no choice. The sergeant's voice came in a harsh whisper. "Contact imminent. Fire only on my command." Alexei sighted down his rifle, aiming at the area of forest where movement had been detected. His hands were surprisingly steady despite his injuries. The human body adapting to crisis, prioritizing survival over pain. The buzzing of drones intensified suddenly, multiple aircraft converging on their position. The sergeant looked up, face contorted with frustrated rage at this unseen, untouchable enemy. "They've spotted us," he growled. "Prepare for contact." Alexei's mind flashed to his training, to the endless drills that now seemed inadequate to the reality of modern combat. They'd been taught to fight against men, not machines. To take cover from bullets, not guided munitions that could strike with precision regardless of concealment. A new sound cut through the buzz of reconnaissance drones, a higher-pitched whine that every soldier recognized instantly. "Attack drone," someone shouted, abandoning protocol in their terror. "Take cover." But there was no cover, not from this. The trees that hid them from Ukrainian infantry offered no protection from above. The fallen logs that stopped bullets wouldn't stop an explosive dropped with precision. Alexei saw it, a larger drone moving fast through a gap in the canopy. Not the small quadcopters they feared during surveillance but something bigger, purpose-built for killing. It seemed to hesitate, hovering, selecting. In that moment, time slowed. Alexei thought of his mother, who would receive another cold official notification. Of Masha, who had promised to wait but would eventually move on with her life. Of the bridges he would never build, the degree he would never complete. All lost to this strange new warfare where men died looking at the sky, killed by operators they would never see, unblooded and physically whole. The drone dipped slightly, a movement Alexei had seen before, the moment before release. "Incoming," the sergeant shouted, but it was already too late. The last thing Alexei saw was light, brilliant, expanding, consuming. The last thing he felt was not pain but a curious sense of release. The sky had been watching, and finally, it had seen him. "Petro. Move, now," Maxim shouted, grabbing their essential equipment, the control tablet and communications gear. Petro was already in motion, disconnecting their data link and securing the drone controller. The buzzing outside was getting louder, Russian reconnaissance almost certainly, having tracked their transmission signals to the police station. They had practiced this scenario countless times. 30 seconds to pack essential equipment. Separate exit routes. Rendezvous point established before each mission. "Go north through the back corridor," Maxim directed, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "I'll head west. Meet at Point Charlie in 30 minutes. Petro nodded, performing one last check of their area to ensure no identifying equipment was left behind. The drone controllers were designed to self-destruct if captured, but other items could reveal valuable intelligence. "Be careful," he said, a ritual parting that had become their good luck charm. "You too," Maxim replied, already moving towards his designated exit. Petro took a deep breath and headed in the opposite direction, moving through the darkened corridor of the abandoned police station. The buzzing outside was growing louder, multiple drones now, systematically searching the area. The Russians were getting better at this game. 6 months ago, they might have simply shelled the entire village indiscriminately after detecting drone activity. Now they were using their own drones to locate the operators first, more precise, more efficient, more deadly. He reached a rear exit, pausing at the doorway to listen. The buzzing seemed more distant on this side of the building. Perhaps he had a clear path. He eased the door open a few centimeters, scanning what he could see of the exterior. A narrow alley led away from the police station, littered with debris but apparently empty. Beyond it lay a residential street with partially collapsed homes offering potential cover for his escape route. Taking another steadying breath, Petro slipped through the door and moved quickly along the wall of the building, staying in its shadow. The morning sun worked against him now, creating sharp contrasts that would make his movement more visible from above. He made it to the end of the alley without incident, then paused again to assess. The buzzing had changed, becoming more concentrated, focused on a specific area. With a sinking feeling, he realized the drones were converging on the western side of the police station. Maxim's exit route. For a moment, he considered turning back, trying to warn his partner or create a diversion. But their protocol was clear: in case of detection, separate immediately, no heroics, no rescue attempts. The mission and the intelligence they carried were the priorities. Swallowing his concern, Petro continued north, moving from cover to cover, a bombed-out car, a collapsed wall, the shell of what had once been someone's garden shed. He moved quickly but carefully, using the techniques they'd developed through painful trial and error. Never run in straight lines. Change direction frequently. Use every available shadow. 5 minutes into his escape, he heard it, the distinctive sound of an attack drone, different from the reconnaissance models that had been circling, followed almost immediately by an explosion from the direction of the police station. Petro froze, instinctively pressing himself against the nearest wall. Had they hit the building? Or had they found Maxim? He forced himself to keep moving. Whatever had happened was beyond his control now. His responsibility was to reach the rendezvous point with the intelligence they'd gathered. The village streets were a maze of destruction, toppled power lines, collapsed buildings, abandoned vehicles. Under different circumstances, this would make pursuit difficult, but the drones above had no need to navigate the chaos on the ground. They simply flew over it. Another explosion sounded, closer this time, sending a shower of debris raining down 2 streets over. They were expanding their search pattern, methodically working through the village. Petro ducked into a partially standing house, moving through what had once been someone's living room. Family photos still hung on one intact wall: a middle-aged couple, children, a dog. Normal life, frozen in time, preserved while everything around it was destroyed. He continued through the house, emerging through a rear window into what had been a garden. From here, he could cut across to the eastern edge of the village, then follow a tree line north to the rendezvous point. The buzzing overhead had become so constant that he almost didn't register its changes anymore, a dangerous adaptation. He forced himself to listen more carefully as he moved from the garden to the cover of a collapsed garage. The drones were spreading out, searching in a grid pattern. Textbook procedure. He had maybe 5 minutes before they swept over his current position. Picking up his pace, Petro worked his way towards the village perimeter, each movement calculated, each pause timed. The skills that had kept him alive for months of drone operations now applied to his own survival. He was within sight of the eastern edge, a row of damaged houses backing onto open fields, with a line of trees about 300 meters beyond, when the buzzing intensified directly overhead. Petro froze beneath the partial shelter of a destroyed porch. Moving would reveal his position. Staying still might allow the thermal imaging to pick up his heat signature against the colder rubble. A classic dilemma of modern warfare: no perfect answer, only calculated risks. He opted to remain motionless, pressing himself against a chunk of concrete that might mask his thermal signature. Above, the buzzing settled into a holding pattern. The drone was hovering, searching. Seconds stretched into minutes. Petro controlled his breathing, willing his heart to slow its frantic pace. The physical sensations of fear were familiar now: the dry mouth, the tight chest, the hyper-awareness of every sound. Then, salvation: artillery fire erupting from the Ukrainian lines several kilometers away. Not aimed at his position but at Russian forces elsewhere in the sector. The sound caused the drone overhead to break its pattern, moving off to assess the new threat. Petro didn't waste the opportunity. As soon as the buzzing faded slightly, he was moving again, staying low, using every available bit of cover as he made his way to the edge of the village. The open ground between the last houses and the tree line presented the greatest danger. 300 meters of exposed terrain, visible from above with no concealment. Under normal circumstances, he would never attempt such a crossing, but circumstances had stopped being normal the moment their position was compromised. He paused at the last house, evaluating options. The buzzing of drones continued but seemed focused elsewhere. Perhaps they'd found something, or someone, more interesting. Small mercies, but he would take them. Taking a deep breath, Petro prepared for the dash across open ground. He would move in bursts: sprint, drop, crawl, sprint again. Basic infantry tactics, taught in the first week of his abbreviated training, now the difference between life and death. He was halfway to the tree line when he heard it, the higher-pitched whine of an attack drone, distinct from the reconnaissance models that had been searching the village. It was coming fast, from the southwest, following the open corridor between village and forest. Whether it had spotted him or was simply patrolling the likely escape routes, the result was the same. In seconds, it would be overhead, its thermal cameras picking him out against the cold ground, its weapons systems locking on. Petro abandoned his measured approach and ran, flat out, desperate, making for the trees that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. The whine grew louder, and he knew without looking that the drone was closing on his position. Modern warfare had created this absurd tableau: a man running across an empty field, pursued not by another man but by a machine, impersonal and relentless. The trees were 30 meters away when Petro heard the subtle change in the drone's sound, the shift that indicated weapon deployment. He'd heard it countless times from the other side, as their own strike drones prepared to release their payloads. 20 meters to the trees. 15. 10. The explosion wasn't what he expected. Not the sharp crack and pressure wave of most drone munitions, but something else, a series of smaller detonations, like firecrackers but louder, accompanied by intense flashes of light. Anti-personnel munitions, fragmentation charges designed to saturate an area with high-velocity shrapnel. Petro felt the impacts before he registered the pain: multiple hits across his back, legs, one arm. The force threw him forward, momentum carrying him the last few meters to the edge of the trees. He crashed into the underbrush, rolling with an instinct born of desperation rather than training. The world tilted and spun, bright spots dancing across his vision, pain blossoming in a dozen places. The drone's whine receded then returned, circling back to assess its work, to confirm the kill, as they would say in their after-action reports, the same language Petro had used so many times. He forced himself to remain motionless despite the overwhelming urge to check his wounds, to understand the extent of the damage. Playing dead might convince the drone operators that their mission was complete. Through slitted eyes, he caught glimpses of the machine as it hovered at the edge of the trees, a larger model than their own strike drones, with a more substantial payload capacity. The Russians were adapting, improving, just as the Ukrainians were. After what seemed an eternity but was probably less than a minute, the drone moved away, apparently satisfied that its target was eliminated. Its whine faded gradually, replaced by the more distant buzzing of reconnaissance models still searching the village. Only when he was certain it was gone did Petro allow himself to assess his condition. The movement sent waves of pain radiating from multiple wounds. His left arm and shoulder had taken the worst of it, blood soaking through his jacket, fragments of metal visible in the torn fabric. His legs had been hit as well. He could feel warm wetness spreading down his right thigh, and his left calf burned with every small movement. Most concerning was the pain in his back, sharp and deep, suggesting fragments had penetrated beyond muscle. But he was alive, and still capable of movement, though each shift of position sent fresh agony through his injured body. The rendezvous point was another kilometer north through the forest. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk. In his current state, it might as well have been a marathon. Still, there was no alternative. Maxim might have made it there already, might be waiting with their emergency medical supplies, or Ukrainian forces might be monitoring the location, as arranged for compromised operations. One step at a time. That was all he could manage, all he could think about. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Petro pulled himself to his feet, using a young tree for support. His vision swam alarmingly, but he remained conscious, another small victory. The first steps were the hardest, each movement awakening fresh agony from his wounds. Blood loss would become a serious concern soon. He needed to keep moving, to reach help before shock and weakness made that impossible. He established a rhythm of sorts: step, breathe, pause, step again. Direction maintained by keeping the rising sun to his right, hidden though it was behind the bare winter branches. Time lost meaning, reduced to the space between footfalls. His thoughts drifted despite his efforts to remain focused. He thought of Sophia, of little Nadia who barely knew him, of the life they'd planned in a world that no longer existed. He thought of Maxim, wondering if his partner had escaped the drone strike at the police station. They'd survived so much together: artillery barrages, tank assaults, previous drone hunts. It seemed impossible that this morning might have been their last. And strangely, he thought of the Russian soldiers they'd killed just hours earlier. The thermal signatures that had vanished in an instant when Angel 1 delivered its payload. Had one of the survivors been the pilot who now tracked him? Was this the universe's idea of balance, the drone hunter becoming the hunted? After what might have been 20 minutes or an hour, Petro's stumbling progress brought him to a small clearing. Through the trees ahead, he could make out the remains of a farmhouse, their designated rendezvous point, chosen for its isolation and the intact cellar that could provide shelter. No sign of Maxim, no sign of the Ukrainian quick reaction force that was supposed to monitor these fallback positions. Petro made it to the edge of the clearing before his strength finally gave out. He collapsed against a tree, sliding down to sit at its base. His vision was tunneling now, darkness encroaching from the edges. Blood loss. Shock. The body's natural response to trauma, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core survival. He knew he should try to dress his wounds, apply pressure, take the emergency medications from his pack. But his hands no longer seemed connected to his will, his thoughts fragmenting and reassembling in patterns that made less and less sense. Instead, he found himself looking up, through the bare branches to the winter sky beyond. Such a clear day, perfect visibility for drone operations. Was he being watched even now? Were cameras recording his final moments from that perfect, detached perspective he'd used to observe so many others? The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, Petro felt an odd sense of completion, a circuit closing, the watcher finally understanding what it meant to be watched. In his increasingly disjointed thoughts, he imagined the footage, thermal imaging showing his heat signature gradually cooling, the bright bloom of his life fading to the same temperature as the surrounding forest. Data points, analytics, intelligence to be processed and filed away. But he was more than data. He was Petro Kovalenko, husband to Sophia, father to Nadia, construction worker, reluctant soldier, human being. That thought gave him unexpected comfort as consciousness began to slip away. Whatever happened next, whether Ukrainian forces found him in time, whether he lived or died in this anonymous forest, he had remained human in a war increasingly fought by and against machines. The buzzing came again, distant at first, then growing closer. Drones, searching. Perhaps Russian, perhaps Ukrainian. It no longer seemed to matter. The sky was watching. It had always been watching. Petro closed his eyes as the sound grew louder, directly overhead now. Watching him, finding him, seeing him, finally, not as a heat signature or a target or an operator, but as what he truly was. A man caught in the machinery of a war that had evolved beyond human scale, yet remained, at its core, a human tragedy. The buzzing faded, or perhaps his ability to hear it did. Either way, the last thing Petro knew was silence, and a strange sense of peace that followed him into darkness. Epilogue. The footage plays on a dozen screens in the command center, drone feeds from multiple sectors of the front, each tracking its own drama of life and death. Officers move between stations, issuing orders, analyzing data, planning the next day's operations. At one station, a young woman in a Ukrainian uniform reviews footage from the previous day's operations. Her eyes are red-rimmed from fatigue, her movements mechanical after 12 hours on shift. The screen shows thermal imagery of a Russian position, figures moving in the pre-dawn darkness, then a flash, a bloom of heat, the signatures dispersing or disappearing entirely. Successful strike confirmed. She notes the coordinates, the estimated casualties, the equipment destroyed, updates the daily statistics that will eventually reach headquarters, be compiled with others, form the basis of situation reports and press releases. On another screen, different footage plays, a Russian drone's perspective this time, captured by Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists. The image shows a man running across an open field, desperate for the tree line ahead. The momentary flash as munitions are deployed, the figure falling, then crawling into the trees. The operator watches dispassionately, cataloging capabilities, tactics, technology, intelligence to be used in the endless adaptation of warfare. No one sees what connects these separate feeds, that the man who directed the strike on the Russian position was the same one gunned down hours later while fleeing. That Alexei and Petro Kovalenko, separated by nationality and uniform but united in their humanity, Both ended their brief military careers on the same winter morning, under the same clear sky. The war continues, evolving, adapting. Drones become more numerous, more capable, more autonomous. The distance between those who kill and those who die grows ever greater. The psychological space between decision and consequence expands beyond human scale. Yet beneath the technology, behind the screens and algorithms and targeting systems, remain people. Sons and daughters, husbands and wives, reluctant warriors caught in machinery they can barely comprehend. And above it all, the sky watches, impartial and eternal, bearing witness to the latest chapter in humanity's oldest story. Final words. In writing The Sky is Watching, I've explored some of the darkest aspects of modern warfare: the psychological toll of constant surveillance, the dehumanizing nature of technological combat, and the shared tragedy that transcends national boundaries. Yet even in this bleakness, I believe there's something profoundly human worth recognizing. The capacity for soldiers like Alexei and Petro to maintain their humanity, their doubts, their connections to home, their recognition of each other's personhood, speaks to something resilient in the human spirit that technology cannot erase. Perhaps the greatest hope in our increasingly technological world is our ability to recognize ourselves in others, even those designated as our enemies. Both Alexei and Petro, despite their different uniforms, shared the same fears, the same reluctance, the same longing for a normal life. In their parallel experiences, we see a truth that transcends the artificial divisions of conflict. I believe storytelling itself is an act of hope, a way to build bridges of understanding across divides that might otherwise seem impassable. By sharing these fictional yet truthful experiences, we remind ourselves that behind every heat signature on a drone operator's screen is a full human life with dreams, fears, and loved ones waiting at home. If there's any light to be found in the darkness of war, perhaps it's in this recognition of our shared humanity, and in our continued capacity for empathy even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Technology may change how wars are fought, but it cannot change what makes us human: our connections to each other, our capacity for compassion, and our enduring hope for a better world. Let us pray for lasting peace in Ukraine.